This podcast is brought to you by Ventilect, your tech recruitment partner for a changing world.
Welcome to Ventilect's Building Our World podcast, the show where I speak to people building and developing the teams and technology that are changing our world. It's no secret, hiring and retaining top technical talent is really difficult, but it's essential for companies to get right so they can continue to innovate and keep moving forward. So how do we get there? Well, I'll be speaking to the talent and recruitment leaders, engineering managers, and more to hear how they do it. So hopefully you can learn a few things to take to the company you work at to level up your tech hiring and retention. What I love about technology, and we've seen this now more than ever, it's changing and evolving so rapidly. But for any of the innovation we see to happen, you need the best people in the best teams. So hopefully this podcast can be a place where we can learn how to do just that. Yes, this is a podcast where I want everyone to learn, but we've got some great guests lined up, and I think there'll be a few stories out there that we can uncover as well. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. This week, I'm joined by Rebecca McPherson, who is the senior recruiter at Runway ML. Now, Rebecca, remarkably, has had a pretty short career, but she's already been building a recruiting function at one of the hottest generative AI startups. So I wanted to get her on to talk all about that, the craze around generative AI, as well as data-driven recruitment. Now, with Rebecca, she's got a mathematics background, something we talk about. So she's pretty well informed and pretty good at the whole data-driven side of things. Now, a lot of recruitment people I speak to, whether they're on the agency side or in-house, love the buzzword data-driven recruitment, but don't really know what it means or how to use it to really boost your recruitment. So that's something I wanted to get the bottom of with Rebecca, and I think we did just that. We talk her background, her career, and more, and I hope you learn a few things from this episode. So without further ado, I'm Alex Boyce, and this is Ventilect's very own podcast. We are live and kicking. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on. Afternoon for me, it's morning for you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Looking forward to a long weekend. And thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No problem at all. So, obviously, we are connected, but with your career, and we'll go into all sorts of stuff, but you studied mathematics at college, and now you are a senior recruiter at an AI startup. How did that happen?
Yeah, pretty unexpected if you had asked me where I would be maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But so I got my undergrad degree in math. I just always really liked math. It's kind of like solving a puzzle for me, or like the logic of it was really interesting. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it, but I just knew I liked studying it, so I did so. When I graduated, I thought maybe I might like teaching. I liked working with people, so I tried that out and absolutely hated it. So it was not for me. So I kind of thought about what I wanted to do next, and I knew I liked working with older students, like students that were in college already. So I went and got a master's for counseling college students, which was a really great program that I did here in California. And we talked a lot about diversity and inclusion and, students from underrepresented backgrounds in the STEM field in particular, because that was something that was close to my heart. And so when I graduated from the master's, I ended up moving to New York. So there I was working on a program where we were aiming to diversify the STEM sciences by helping students from underrepresented backgrounds get into biomedical PhDs, so like biology, chemistry, that kind of thing. And I really liked the mission of the work. Again, it was really close to like the things that I was passionate about, but I didn't feel very challenged there. It was very slow pace. There wasn't a lot of opportunities for innovation or change. And so I started kind of thinking about my next move. And I knew some people that were working in like tech startups, and it sounded like a really exciting place, really high growth. And so I started looking into that more. And then within, tech startups, I was kind of like, what can I do? Where would my skills transfer well? And, recruiting, again, just working with people and having that focus on DE&I seemed like a natural fit. So I applied to a whole bunch of places and ended up starting my first job in, I think, like fall of 2019 in the tech industry as a recruiting coordinator, which my expectation for that role is that as a coordinator, I would be mostly scheduling and kind of learning about the function. But I was doing phone screens within my first week. So it was a very kind of like throw you in the deep end and see if you can swim kind of role, which luckily I was able to swim. And then, that's how I ended up here.
Perfect. So this was 2019, and then when COVID hit in March 2020, did that affect your recruiting career at all? Because I know with some companies, they just cut recruiting. There was some really sort of quick decisions made. Obviously, 6 months later, it flipped again. How was it for you?
So I actually didn't stay at that first company for very long. And it wasn't intentional. I was planning to stay there for a while, but being new in the role, I decided I wanted to do some networking with different people in the space, and happened to stumble upon the person who is now currently my manager, just on that LinkedIn's like people you may know or whatever. So I found her there, and she was a head of talent, and she also was really, really focused on DE&I, which again, where I was hoping to focus my time as well. So I just reached out to her as kind of like a casual, like, could we have a coffee chat? I'd love to learn about how you got to where you are and what kind of initiatives you're doing. And turned out that she was hiring, and she, I guess, liked my initiative of reaching out to her. So I ended up interviewing there, and I decided to join that company, which was in January of 2020. So just right before COVID started. We were an in-office company, so I was there for like a month and a half. And then everything happened. We thought that we'd be working from home for like 2 weeks and then we'd be back in the office. That is obviously not what happened.
Was it 2 weeks to flatten the curve or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah. It was like, everyone go home for 2 weeks and then it'll be fine. So clearly not. But yeah, so there was so much adjusting in terms of like, how do we do this thing that we've done very well in the office? How do we bring it remote? How do we, still engage candidates and make them feel like they're getting a good sense of what it's like to work on our team? How do we feel like we're still getting a good sense of them as a person? One of the kind of like lesser known parts of recruiting, I think, is, when you meet someone face to face and you're kind of like giving them a tour around the office and like showing them around, you can kind of like get a sense of a person. Obviously, it's not like the end all be all of whether you hire them, but, if they're like nice and friendly, or if they're kind of rude to some of the people in the office, that kind of thing, we felt was like a really important part of the recruiting process. So we had to figure out ways that we could still get that sense of a person without actually being in person with them. So yeah, it was a big, big adjustment, but we ended up being remote at that company until I left. So yeah, I think we ended up being very successful at it, but it was a lot of adjustment in the beginning.
It's crazy, isn't it? Because it's literally 3 years ago, prety much today, or, a couple of weeks before. It seems like a different world, like pre and post COVID. It was just, it actually changed so much, especially in tech in terms of remote culture and recruiting as well. But yeah, it just seems like an age ago now. So much has happened since then.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of almost like let people think about things in a different way. So like before it was just kind of like, yeah, everyone's in office. I mean, some companies were still doing remote, but like most people were doing an office, like most people were doing things a certain way. And then it was like, now we have to find new ways of doing things. And now even still, technically we can go back to work and stuff, but we still have to think about new ways to do things, because there are situations where maybe you hired a bunch of different places during COVID. And now if you want people to come back, what are you going to do? Are you going to make them move? Are you going to open up offices in different places? Or are you going to do a hybrid work environment, which has its own set of challenges? So yeah, there's just like, I think it's like almost like forcing people to re-examine how we do things and try to find like the best way to do it versus just the way that it's always been done, which is, I don't know, a happy accident from COVID. Obviously, COVID was a very horrendous thing that happened to a lot of people and everything. But I think that was from the like people function perspective. I think that was kind of a cool side effect, is just being able to try things differently than we had before.
Indeed. And then you joined Runway, and you were the first recruiter in to a startup. What made you take on that challenge? Because I mean, there's a huge difference even between being the first and the second recruiter in to a business. What made you jump at that chance?
Yeah, so the company I was at before Runway was Frame.io, and when I joined, I think I was like number 5 on the team. So it was already a pretty well-established team, already had like all the systems in place, had a really good like repeatable process of just success. And Frame.io ended up actually being acquired by Adobe, and I got a little bit of a glimpse of like the big company style, which wasn't really my cup of tea. I liked being at that smaller company, which is why I decided to leave Adobe and look elsewhere. And in thinking about what I wanted to do next, I really wanted to join something earlier when things weren't already well built out and like smoothly running. I wanted to like be part of getting to that point. I wanted to be part of building the team and building the processes and documentation. And so I was looking at earlier stage startups. I think I was open to being a second recruiter, but I think in my heart, I really wanted to be the first one, just because there's so much more that hasn't been done. So much more opportunity to do things. And actually, the manager that I had at Frame.io, who was that person that I had reached out to on LinkedIn, she also didn't want to stay at Adobe because of the big company thing. So we actually interviewed together at different places when we decided to leave Adobe, and we both landed the role at Runway. So we're both here now again, which has been really great because I did feel like maybe I was a little bit junior in my career to be a first recruiter. Yeah. But having her to like be sort of like my backup and still someone I could like lean on very heavily just like really made me feel more comfortable that like, okay, I might not know everything that I have to do. I might not know how to do everything I have to do, but I can figure it out, and I can figure it out with her support. So it just made me a lot more confident.
So you're coming in and at Runway, the technical standards of your teams are really high. Some of the talent you have in is unbelievable on the software engineering and machine learning. And obviously this podcast is about recruitment, but sort of tech recruitment as well. So how are you as a first recruiter in with these incredibly high standards and high bar? I mean, where do you even start to build some sort of process, relationships with hiring managers to build a machine that gets the best talent in?
Yeah. So I guess first of all, I should say I had no prior experience in tech recruiting until I joined Runway. So it was a really big learning curve for me. And I think one of the biggest things that helped me was just being very upfront about that. So when I was talking to the hiring manager, the CTO was like the main person I was working with in the beginning. But we also had like a front end manager and a back end manager who had been at the company for years and years. So they were also really good resources. And just being as like transparent as possible with them that like I know very little about tech stuff and like engineering, and just using them as like resources to learn more. I joined a whole ton of meetings. Like they would have like a weekly back-end meeting, a weekly front-end meeting. I would join those to just learn and learn and learn, asking a lot of questions. So that was sort of like learning about tech recruiting. And then in terms of like building this recruiting motion, there's like so many different aspects to think of, right? Like there's kind of like the obvious stuff, like you need process and documentation, and you need tools like an ATS and a sourcing tool and this kind of stuff. And then it's also about, I think, because if you're a first recruiter, I mean, obviously the company has done some hiring, but everyone is going to like, every company is going to have different levels of like their understanding of hiring. And so you also want to make sure that you're coming in and kind of understanding what's already set in motion and what's already working and what's maybe not. Like, for example, Runway had a really great, before I even started, had a really great time to like get an offer out to a candidate. So it was like a very quick engagement, which is, good for offer acceptance to have that like process move very fast. And so that was something that they were doing really well already. So I didn't really have to think about the speed. Some of the things that we did need to think about were like, how do we be very efficient with the team's time? So we actually did a ton of iteration on the interview processes. So, and figuring out like which steps should be at what point in the process. And we kept finding that we were doing on-sites and people were failing. And the on-site's like obviously a panel of interviews. And the one interview that was the most telling, like everything else could be a yes, but if this interview was a no, we weren't going to hire that person. And so we're like, okay, that needs to be at the front of the process because we need to weed them out and not waste everyone's time just to get a no at that point.
You'd be surprised. Even like I've worked with some, I won't name names, but some big, pretty decent tech companies. And yeah, they don't do that. They have this weird value fit interview right at the end. And if, I don't know if it's the same, but if one person flags something, it's all over. And just do it at the beginning. Let's save some time.
Yeah. Ours was a technical challenge. So I think also it made sense to do it right from the beginning. But so you need to kind of like be open to like iterating and experimenting. We tried a ton of different things before we landed at the process that we have now that we feel very confident in. But we're still, experimenting and changing things and kind of just trying to like, we do kind of like a weekly check-in, actually send managers, hiring managers, like a pipeline recap of how things are going. And then we have like a weekly learnings that we started doing in the past few months. So like if I did a bunch of sourcing last week and I realized that like this company has like really good machine learning engineers, like that would be like learning. Or if we tried a different title for one of our roles and applications went down and they weren't that relevant, like, okay, that title didn't work, let's try something else. So still like very iterative and trying to be experimental and figure out like what works best to get us to where we need to be. And then I think another thing you mentioned earlier is like that, like building relationships with hiring managers is so important. And especially as a first recruiter, they're already doing something and it kind of works for them. And so then when you come in and you're like, I'm going to do everything differently, it's like, can be a bit of a not like fun time. But so I think taking more time to kind of, again, understand what's working for them, understand how they like to do things, and then like slowly introducing new things so that it doesn't feel like we're taking things over. But at the same time, like we were hired for a reason. So we are going to have a say in how the hiring goes. And then I think the other thing that I didn't think about as much before I joined, but was kind of a bit of a like wake up call when I did, is like at Frame.io, we had this really good motion. It was working really well. It was really repeatable and good. And not all of it was going to translate to Runway because, Frame.io at that point was a Series C company, close to 300 people, like pretty good employer branding and recognition. Runway was a Series B, like 25 employees, not really much employer branding efforts happening. So it was a very different kind of game. And like, so that's some of the things that we had to think about. Okay, like what worked at Frame.io that will transfer over, that we can keep doing? What worked there that might not work here? And how can we do it differently here to make it work better? Initially, we did do a lot of employer branding initiatives. We're still doing those. Like we very quickly tried to get on some of the best places to work lists, which really help with applications.
Yeah.
And, like you said, smaller teams typically have less resources. So we also tried to do a lot of things that were free. So like, having our profile on Glassdoor, having a profile on different sites like built in and obviously you can like upgrade to a paid package or whatever, but we just started with the free ones just to have a baseline of something. So if people Googled us, they'd be able to find some resources about us that were, accurate and on brand and all that. So it was basically just thinking about all the different pieces of, recruiting, from pipeline building to interviewing to closing, and how can we do those things in a way that works for the place that we're at now and for the people that we're trying to get.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, with your employer branding as well, was this like a conscious thing, or because you have so much to think about, and employer branding is basically marketing. It's this whole other thing.
Yeah.
Was it just something you just tried to sort of tick along, or was it like a conscious, like, because your employer branding is really good. So yeah, I mean, how did that look?
Yeah, it was a very conscious effort.
Okay.
One of the things that my manager and I did before we even started at Runway was we sat down and we had kind of like a wish list of all the things that we would love to have in the people function once we start. And so we, had the tools that we wanted, and then we had like partnerships that we would want, employer branding that we would want, different stuff like that. And we kind of had it all laid out, and we thought about, again, all the different parts of the process. So pipeline building is, part sourcing. So just needing a sourcing tool, needing us to understand the profile so we can get the right people, having good messaging that we can put out. And then, other than sourcing, there's inbound applications, which the only way to like do anything about inbound applications is employer branding, because you want to get the right people getting to you. So then we did a bunch of initiatives around the employer branding. And so that with the sourcing helped with the pipeline building. And then from there, we looked at like the interview process, and we're like, okay, so for the interview process, we need to know who are the right people, what are the right interviews, what's the right process. And again, like going through that iterative thing that I was telling you. And then like the closing stage, we were able to take a lot of what we had done at Frame.io, so we didn't have to change too much about that, but there's still, things that are a little bit different. So we had to kind of get more creative and play around with things. But yeah, so basically just looking at all the different parts of the cycle and like, how do we improve each of these functions? And that's how we came up with employer branding being a very conscious effort on our part, because we wanted inbound applications to be better.
Yeah, perfect. And with your different positions, especially like the technical positions, I mean, how long did it take for you to come up with any sort of data to be like, because different positions require a different amount of attention, different amount of profiles. Some positions are obviously a lot more in demand than others, so candidates slip off.
Yeah.
I mean, how much of an awareness did you have of that, and is that something you've built up in your time?
Yeah, I think there's so when it comes to that really like quick iterative process, you want to be careful that you're not doing it too quick. Like, two things happen and you're like, let's change it. It might be too fast. Like, maybe wait a little bit more. But typically, if we would see if we were doing like a specific role, we would see 3 on-sites that got no's. It's like, okay, that's too many, because if you think about the amount of time that took for the team to do all of those on-sites, it's a lot of time. It's an expensive thing. And also, the candidate's time too. Like, what the candidate gets all the way to on-site and doesn't pass, like, that's not a great, experience for them either. So typically we would see 3 on-sites and be like, that's enough data points for us to know that we should try something different. And also the other thing is, like, we weren't making drastic changes. We were still doing the same interviews, but kind of moving them around. And one of the things that actually we've talked about a lot is our coding challenges are pretty difficult. So the like live coding that we'll do, they're pretty difficult challenges. And sometimes we'll like get enough no's over time that we're like, are they too difficult? Are we doing something wrong? And then like, we'll get a week where we have like a few yeses. And then I've like had like interviewers tell me like, this was like such a good feeling, because like it made me feel like, yes, we are doing the right thing. We just were waiting for the right person. And like, it's such like a good feeling that like, okay, we didn't lower our standards, but we still found the right people.
Yeah.
So in terms of like data, like hard numbers, we weren't like really pulling things out of Greenhouse or anything, just because it was a bit early, but just looking at the data points of like, how many people have failed this? Does it make sense that many people have failed this? And that kind of thing. So depending on like what the things are, like if it's changing our coding challenge, that's a bit more of a lift than like moving around the interview steps. So kind of some of those easier things to move, we would iterate a lot more quickly. And some of the things that would be a bigger lift to change, we kind of wait a little bit more to see what would happen first.
Interesting what you say about the hiring managers being really pleased. That's one thing we always try to push here at Ventilect. If we're working just directly with a hiring manager, or sometimes it's the talent, internal talent and the hiring manager, I always say, a tech interview for an engineering lead or manager should be a meeting of minds. It should be a pleasure. So how can we get there? And having a challenge before, or us doing more screening or whatever, because you'll see this as well. If you have a run of tech interviews that go bad, that could be an hour of that person's time wasted disrupting from code reviews, things like that. And ultimately it gets to a point where they see that invite in their calendar and they're just like, oh, they want to be excited for it. And it's interesting you brought that up.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And we've gotten a lot of good feedback from candidates as well, that they have fun with the exercises that we do. So I think they are challenging, but like that's kind of the point, is to challenge them. They're a little bit more like problem solving type challenges as opposed to just like, can you do this thing? It's more like, how do you think about this problem? Which I think people really enjoy, both on the interviewer side and the candidate side. And we've done some really fun things with our interview processes too. I wasn't hiring for this role, but my manager was, and it was a product design. And so one of the things we did was, for the on-site, we wanted to do like a working session with them. So they would come in and meet with the hiring manager, and he would give them a prompt and be like, we're going to work on this problem today. So it'd be kind of like designing something for like a fake product. And then they would meet with our technical team to be like, what are the limitations, or how, like, these are the things I'm thinking of doing. Is that technically going to happen, or is it realistic? And then they would have like an hour of heads down time where they're working on the problem and actually coming up with their solution to it. And then afterwards they would present it to the team. And we found that was such a cool way for us to see, like, one, like how quickly can they jump into something that's like a bit unfamiliar and on the spot. Obviously, how did they do in the challenge? And then also, what is it like to work with them? Like, if they're like, talking to the technical person and they're being like very, strict with what they want to do and kind of like fighting them on it. Like that's like one thing that like maybe they'll be like that in the role or that kind of thing. And we also got really great feedback from candidates on that too, because they also were like, this is what it would actually be like to do this role with these people. So it was kind of a cool way to show like a really good idea of what the role is versus just like talking to someone for 30 minutes and figuring out if maybe they're fit or not. So that was some of the really cool things that we've done with interviews and just making them feel fun for the candidate too. I think interviewing can be such a like scary and nervous and like not fun thing to do. So anything we can do like make that a better experience for them is super important.
Yeah. I think as well with live coding, and it's the age-old debate that you see it on LinkedIn a lot, take-home challenge versus live coding. Every time I do a post about it on LinkedIn, and if I ever want to post on LinkedIn quite a lot, and if I ever fancy a post with lots of engagement and lots of comments, I do post that just to ruffle some feathers, because some people hate that live coding, someone watching them do their work, and then some people don't want to spend their weekends doing a challenge or their evenings doing a challenge.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff too around like the take-home challenges, because you can give someone like, oh, this should take you about 3 to 4 hours to do. But if you've got someone who maybe isn't currently working or doesn't have like a lot of personal responsibilities, maybe they'll spend like 8 hours on it and it'll be really, really good. Versus someone like, maybe someone who's a mother and has a lot of, other responsibilities. So they really only do spend the like 3 to 4 hours on it. And maybe it's not as good. But if they had spent the 8 hours, because if they had the 8 hours, maybe it would have been as good. So also thinking about like how different situations can give people like different opportunities to do better or worse at a take-home, which is the same for live coding. Some people get more nervous having to perform on the spot, and then that can make them perform worse in a live coding versus a take-home. So there's just pros and cons on all sides. And we found that the live coding is good. Again, just to like give them a sense of, they get to know someone on the team. We get to know them more as a person and also hear what they're thinking as they're going through the challenge. We always encourage people to kind of like think out loud through their process, and also like they can be collaborative. Like if they get to a point in the challenge where they don't know what to do next, they can talk to the interviewer and be like, here's where I'm stuck. I'm thinking this or this, not really sure. And then the interviewer like collaborate with them. And so I think that's kind of a cool part of the live challenge, which is I think one of the reasons why we've stuck with that over the take home.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned about different processes suiting different people. I think this ties into what I wanted to come on to next. We talk a lot about diverse and inclusive workplaces, but to get to that, you need an inclusive interview process to get the right people in. And I know that's something you're passionate about, and as we all should be. So, I mean, when you're viewing things with that lens on, with processes and just recruiting in general, what sort of stuff did you do at Runway to try and get to that?
Yeah. So when we think about like DE&I, there's kind of different buckets that I like to think of it in. So one is like the D, diversity, which is just kind of like the stats, right? Like how many women do we have at the company? How many people of color do we have at the company, et cetera? And that really is driven by recruiting and hiring efforts. The equity is more around the like pay equity, making sure that levels are clear, salaries are clear, the offers that we're making match up with the levels that the person would be. And, if someone has the same level of experience, they should have the same offer. That's like the E equity part. And then the inclusion part is really just about making people feel like they fully belong at the company. They can be their full selves at the company. And so that's more, I guess, on the like employee experience or people side. So from recruiting, we do an unconscious bias and interview training that everyone at the company goes through, regardless of whether you're on an interview panel or not. And that's a training where we go through our interview process and also talk about like how we've taken some bias out of the stages, but also the fact that it's almost impossible to take all of the bias out of interviewing. So talking about the different types of bias, how you can kind of start to check yourself in an interview. And I think one of the like most interesting types of bias for me is confirmation bias, which is where you will make like a snap judgment about someone, which everyone does. It's how our brains work. It's not weird to do that. But then if you're interviewing them, you'll spend more of the time trying to prove yourself right than proving yourself wrong. And so you'll just pick out the things that confirm that you're right. Whether that's you like the person, so then you won't listen to the parts where they don't fit, or if you don't like them, you won't listen to parts where they do fit. So we always challenge our like interviewers not to try to eliminate bias, because you can't, because it's literally physically how our brains are wired, but to recognize when it's happening so that you can do something to undo it. So for like confirmation bias, if you come in and you like see that this person went to like the same college as you, and you're like, oh yes, this person's going to be amazing, I love it. That's fine. But you need to kind of think about almost like trying to prove yourself wrong. And at the end of the day, at the end of the interview, if you were right, you were right. But you tried to prove yourself wrong so you can feel confident in you being right about that person being a good fit. So I think that's some of the big thing that we try to get out of that training is like, don't feel ashamed for having bias. It's how our brains are wired, but recognize them so that you can do something to combat them in an interview setting. So that training's been very big. And then we also just try to diversify our sources as well. So when we do sourcing, we, specifically target people from underrepresented groups. We target women. When we are, reviewing applications, it's something that we always think about. And then some of the employer branding efforts, like we were talking about. So we have a profile on In Her Site, which is a profile or a platform for women to go to look at like reviews. Basically, it's kind of like a Glassdoor, but specifically focused on women.
Okay. What's that called? Sorry?
In Her Site.
In Her Site. Awesome.
Yeah, like
people
SIH.
listening will love that.
Yeah. It's a really cool platform. And so like we, try to also do our employer branding efforts that are focused on DE&I as well, not just like the general ones. And that helps with like inbound applications being more diverse. And then we also, in our job descriptions, I think everyone kind of knows that women and people from underrepresented groups tend to apply to jobs less if they don't feel like they meet 100% of the requirements.
Yeah.
So we will try to make our requirements as open-ended as possible for that reason. So people are less likely to select themselves out. Those are some of the things that we do to make like the top of the funnel very diverse. And then, as diverse as the top of the funnel is, it makes it easier to have success in hiring people from different backgrounds.
That's awesome. That's great insight. Yeah, because in tech, I mean, in terms of like the raw numbers, obviously I would say it's male dominated, and then in like computer science, and I mean, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, but you studied maths. What was the split like there, and how did the diversity spread look in your course?
Yeah, it was very interesting. In sort of the like first and second year math classes, it was like a ton of different people, big classrooms. A lot of people were like in those math classes. And then when you got to like the third and fourth year, it was like a class of maybe 20 people, and mostly male, mostly white. That's definitely something that I noticed even from, undergrad. And that I think that maybe is what has like brought it top of mind for me all the way through my career.
Were you always very aware? I mean, I'm guessing at school as well, you were very good at maths and had an interest in it. Did you feel, I know this is a leading question and I'm not supposed to ask leading questions. I do it every episode. But did you feel that, it was, people were almost surprised that you would pursue this, or you were good at it compared to, say, if your male counterpart was?
Yeah, I had a bit of the opposite experience. So I was the only like girl in my family, like my generation, like cousins and stuff, for a really long time. We have 10 cousins overall, and there's only 3 girls, and I was the only one until like the 7th person. So I kind of had an experience where like all of my family was trying to push me to be a little bit more boyish, or whatever traditionally boys would do. Like they'd be like, go outside and play rough, or like do sports, or do these things. And so I think like from my family's perspective, like they all thought it was really cool that I was in math. Like they were like, that's super awesome. Like you're breaking all these barriers and this kind of thing. From like other perspectives, like when I would meet people out and like tell them I'm a math major, everyone thinks like that is the coolest thing in the world, because they're like, everyone hates math. Like that's so weird that you like it. I think like from my family perspective, it was less weird because I had always kind of been pushed in that direction. But like meeting strangers, there was a little bit more of that like, oh, wow, like that's not something I would ever expect from you. And I don't know if it was because I was a girl or because it's just like most people aren't math majors, so it's not something you expect from most people, or what. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting factor to think about.
But do you think, because there is an imbalance, and then that, I think that feeds into tech, the tech talent coming in. I mean, so yeah, do you think that's something that starts pretty early on that's pretty hard to undo?
Yeah, I mean, even if you think about like, there's a ton of research on this, but like the types of toys that girls and boys are conditioned to play with, Like girls play with dolls, which is like taking care of a baby, or we have like kitchen sets or things like this, and boys are playing with Legos or things that are a lot more like hands-on and actually like help their brains start to think about things in different ways. And it's really, really interesting research, but that happens so early on. And so I think, even from like a child, it's already being conditioned in you, like how you think about problems and how you think about the world and what you are supported in doing and what you're not. And I know, like, again, my family pushing me to do the more quote unquote boyish things is probably why it didn't feel weird for me. But I know a lot of people don't have that experience, and they have more of the like their families pressuring them to like wear dresses and makeup and all this kind of stuff. So I know mine was not the traditional answer, but yeah, like I think that stuff happens so early, and it's so interesting to look at like the types of things that affect us in childhood and like lead to the problems that we have now, where like not a lot of women go into engineering, although it has been getting really a lot better. Luckily, I think we're seeing it trend in the right direction. And I see it very concretely. Like if we're looking for a staff level engineer, the amount of women who are at that level is very low compared to if we're looking for like a mid-level engineer. There's so many more women, which is just a factor of like, if you're looking at a staff person like 10, 20 years ago, that's when women weren't going into engineering as much. But if you're looking at mid-level, like 3 to 5 years ago, that is when women started going in more. So it's like, okay, so in 10 years, maybe we'll have more women at the senior level, and hopefully it's just going to keep going up and up and up and trend that way.
Yeah. So we're going in the right direction, but a lot needs to be done.
Yeah. And I think, too, an interesting point is like, there's so many initiatives we can do right now to like find women and bring them to Runway. But there's also this, like, we should also be working with people at a younger age to, maybe help them get into like tech. And there's this program that we've worked with in the past called Built by Girls. And they will partner you with a girl who's in high school, and you'll have like monthly talks with them about like where you are in tech, how you got to tech, and kind of encouraging them to go in that direction if they want to, which is a really great program. So if any of your listeners are interested in that, and you don't have to be an engineer to do that. Like I did that as a recruiter. People on my team also did it. So you don't have to be an engineer, but just someone in tech to kind of help them learn more about the industry, because it feels like such a weird thing when you're in high school. You're like, what is tech? So it's kind of nice to have that concrete talking to a person who's actually in the field.
Absolutely. I like that though, when companies actually do something to like make a difference, like they do as they say. I am a bit cynical sometimes, but there are so many tech companies out there that are just buzzwords and will just say the right things, and then you scratch the surface, or you speak to people in the company, which obviously a recruiter I do, but I am biased because I speak to the people who want to leave. So yeah, I think it's great when companies actually do stuff, partnerships. I know some tech companies will do like academies to get people into technology, and obviously focus that on different, the genders and people of color as well, which is great.
We also
tangible stuff.
Yeah, one of the other things I really appreciate about Runway is like it's sometimes like the DE&I is like really pushed by like the people team, and like it's not something that the rest of the company really cares about as much. But at Runway, I feel like it is like very top down. Like this is something that we're all behind. Like we all value it very strongly, and so even like when it comes to our user base, we did a film festival, and a lot of the submissions were not from like diverse backgrounds. And so then we thought about like, how can we maybe partner with different groups who, represent different people in film to see like next year's submissions, let's try to get them more diverse. Like, can we, so we have like partnerships that we're working on right now. I won't mention them because nothing is finalized yet, but so I think that's really cool too, is not just from like our hiring perspective, but also from our user base. Like our whole mission is to make storytelling more accessible so that more people can tell their stories. And if we just have this one group of people telling their stories over and over, we're not hearing that diversity of story and experience and thought. And so, it's not just from the hiring perspective, but it's also from our user base perspective, and how can we make this tool more accessible and democratize this whole field of storytelling as well.
Yeah, fantastic. You now, obviously, you've been in recruitment for not that long, to be honest. And it's and obviously you've done a lot. But I wanted to talk about the data side of things, because you have obviously referenced data a lot, and you're pulling a lot of data. I mean, most recruiters I speak to, myself, like numbers, data, hate it for just the people side. And a lot of recruiters learn how to do the numbers thing. for you, pulling data out of an ATS must be so easy. It must just be a walk in the park. Is it something you enjoy? Is it something maybe, a unique skill of yours that you can really bring to a role that maybe other people in recruitment can't?
I think so. And I think, we use Greenhouse as our ATS, and I think they've also made it pretty, I won't say easy because it's not easy for everyone, but they've made it pretty accessible to be able to like pull different reports. And they even just like kind of have pre-made ones for you. So you just have to click on it and like change some of the parameters. But yeah, I mean, I think it's such a huge part of recruiting because you want to see like how you're doing, how's the pipeline, like where are maybe the faults in your interview process, where maybe the like down sides of like sources that you're getting from different people. Like if you're working with an external agency and like they have like really good pass rates and you know like that's a relationship you want to continue, or if you are sourcing from this specific tool and like none of those people are really getting past the interviews, like that's probably a tool you don't want to use anymore. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important skill for recruiters to have. I don't think that everyone likes numbers, but I also think a little bit of that might just be a bit of fear mongering that, again, has probably been instilled in us since we were kids. Like math is the scary subject. No one likes math.
Well,
but
what
it
is
can
that?
be accessible, I think.
Do people, because people say, I mean, I say it myself, oh, I can't do maths, it's not for me. My brain doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Is that actually a thing, or is that just conditioning?
I mean, it might be a little bit of both. For some people, yeah, like maybe your brain doesn't work that way. Like I'm not an artist. My brain does not work that way. And so, that's fair. But I think there is a little bit of conditioning. And again, if you think about the types of people who are conditioned in different ways, like it's probably more of a conditioning factor for women than it might be for men. But
yeah,
I think like everyone, like if you look at like memes or TikToks or just like general, like everyone like hates on math a little bit. Because it seems like this thing like doesn't really matter and you're never going to have to use the like Pythagorean theorem in real life. But I think the thing about math too is it can get so easy to fall behind. So even like myself, when I was in middle school, which is like 6th grade, I went on a trip and I missed like a week of class and I came back and it was the distributive property and I didn't learn it because I wasn't there for that week and I could not figure it out. And I ended up having to like go to my teacher like during lunch to like have her show me how to do it because I was like, this does not make any sense to me. And the distributive property is something you use your entire math career. So if I hadn't figured it out at that point, like I never would have been good at math because I couldn't have figured out that thing. Because it just like layers on top of itself. So as soon as you kind of fall behind, it's really hard to pull yourself back up. And so I think that's also maybe not conditioning, but maybe more of a system of like how it's taught. Yeah, I mean, I think it happens such an early stage that people just kind of like discount math and they're like, I'm never going to need this. It doesn't matter. I have a calculator. But I think it's also a bit more of a mindset. Like you can be bad at like math. Like you can like maybe be like, I didn't get good grades in math in school, but still understand like the logic of how data works and why it's important and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I see a lot of people say people in recruitment overdo the whole data thing. They see this, our data-driven recruitment, and then they just try to pull numbers from everywhere and just try and make something happen. I mean, do you think, obviously someone who knows numbers quite well and data, do you think that's something that's easily done?
I think you have to be careful about what data you're looking at because at the end of the day, recruiting is, a function where you're working with people and people will do things that you will never expect. And so the data is a good way to stay informed, but you also just have to like be prepared for like situations. I think I was listening to, maybe it was the last episode you put out, but I think the guest was talking about how if you're focusing too much on a data point, like the offer acceptance, maybe you're paying people too much. So it's really easy to close them.
Michaela said that.
Yeah. So that could be an issue of like, if you're looking at, one data piece that looks really good, like why does it look good? So I don't think it's necessarily like overdoing it with data, but I think you have to contextualize it really well. So, we had a very, very high offer acceptance rate at Frame.io. We've got a really high one at Runway as well. And we still feel very good about like the offers that we put out being equitable and within our salary bands. So we try to think about like, why is our offer acceptance rate high? Well, we have conversations with candidates about compensation in the very first phone screen to make sure if we're too far off, like we can just end it there, not waste their time, not waste our time. We have a very close process with the candidate. So we'll talk to them a few different times throughout the interview process to make sure that we have a good idea of what their interest level is, to make sure we have a good idea of what offer we think they'd accept, and just obviously relationship building as well, which helps with the close process. So we attribute it to that versus like making wildly outlandish offers. But so I think that's the thing about data is like data is really important, but it needs to be contextualized. And some data pieces aren't important, some are, and it really depends on your company that you're with, what stage you're at, what your goals are, that kind of thing. So I don't necessarily, maybe some people overdo it, but I think the important thing is just if you're using data, make sure it's contextualized and make sure it makes sense. And it's like that's the thing, data tells a story, right? It tells a story of what you're doing well and what you might not be doing well, and how it's like what's making it go well, what's not making it go well. So I think that's the important thing to remember about data is like at the end of the day, numbers are only important if they're aligned with your goal and what you're hoping to do.
Absolutely. Never a truer word spoken. I wanted to talk about yourself as well. We cover kind of what you've done, not been in the industry long and done a lot. What's the future hold for you? I know in the recruitment industry now and talent acquisition as well, can seem like a crazy time. You see the stuff on LinkedIn, our LinkedIn feeds and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of your career moving forward, what are the things you want to do? What do you want to achieve?
Yeah. I think so. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about this role, like being the first recruiter at a company, is I've gotten to touch so many different parts of recruiting than I did in my last role. Again, because, Frame.io, when I joined, had such like a good working motion, I didn't really touch anything outside of like hiring. At Runway, I've been able to do hiring, employer branding, operations within recruiting. I've been able to do a lot more on the people function as well. So like building out an onboarding program, working on performance reviews, survey engagement, all these different kinds of things that I wasn't able to do before. And I think it's starting to make me think about what my next move is. I don't know exactly what I want to do yet. But I'm really enjoying working on like the HR side of things. And I think that that's something I want to grow into a little bit more over the next year and kind of see where I want to land. I also am interested in management. So just seeing like what that path could look like for me here would be really interesting. And just being able to like mentor and help grow other people. That's something that I'm really interested in. So yeah, don't know exactly what the future holds, but staying in people function for sure, whether that's a mix of recruiting and HR or maybe going further into HR, and then hopefully leadership one day.
Do you think if you went into leadership, would you miss the recruiting side? One thing we discuss a lot on this podcast is how, when you're recruiting, you can measure it. You can measure your impact as you move up into management. It's harder to do. Obviously, you haven't made that jump yet, but do you think that's something that will happen to you?
I'm sure it will be a bit of like an adjustment period for sure. And I think it's also a bit harder just as a manager in general to like measure your success through the success of your reports. It's like a little bit more abstract, I guess. So I think that will probably definitely be an adjustment period that I'll have to figure out. And I think also, doing some of these more like HR focused projects, I'm already getting a little taste of that. Again, like with recruiting, it's like you make a hire, it's a really great feeling, it's a concrete win. In HR, like you do performance reviews and like it went well, we think, like no one is getting fired, no one's quitting, everything's good. But it's not as like concrete of like, cool, like we did this thing and it had this really outsized impact on the team. So I think I'm already getting a little taste of that doing some of the more like HR focused projects. And so hopefully it won't be as big of a shock when I go into management. But I think definitely there will be at least a period of adjustment where I have to figure out like where are the things that I can still feel good about or the things that I can still get excited about and feel very like concretely like I'm doing a good job. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Rebecca, we will end it there, but thank you so much for your time coming on, sharing your story and all the topics you're passionate about as well.
Yeah,
really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this as well. Really appreciate you reaching out and having me on the show. And good luck with the rest of it.
Thank you. So you made it to the end. Well done and congrats. The fact that you're even here shows that, well, maybe you learned a few things and got inspired by the story and career of our guest. If you really did like it, then please tell your friends and colleagues. And if you want to keep up to date with new episodes weekly, then be sure to hit that subscribe button. Take care of yourself, and thank you so much for listening.